On June 16, 1963, a rocket rose from Baikonur carrying a 26-year-old Soviet cosmonaut named Valentina Tereshkova. Her radio call sign was Cheka, the Seagull. The mission was Vostok 6. In the language of the Cold War space race, it was a technical flight, a political broadcast, and a human experiment all at once. It made Tereshkova the first woman in space, and it did so only 2 years after Yuri Gagarin had made the first human orbit. The achievement was real, but the story is more complicated than a poster. Tereshkova's place in the program did not mean the Soviet space establishment had suddenly become equal. The program also wanted another symbolic first before the United States could claim it, yet symbols still require bodies, training, machinery, risk, and courage. Vostok 6 placed a young woman alone inside a small spacecraft, sent her into orbit, and asked the world to watch what Soviet technology and Soviet ideology said they could do. Tereshkova's path to the capsule began far from an elite aviation academy. She was born in the Yaroslavl region in 1937. Her father died during the Soviet-Finnish War, and her mother worked in a textile factory. Tereshkova herself worked in textiles and studied by correspondence. One skill made her especially interesting to space recruiters: parachuting. The early Vostok spacecraft did not land with the cosmonaut inside. Near the end of the descent, the cosmonaut ejected and parachuted separately. That made parachute experience more than a hobby. It was part of survival. After Gagarin's flight in 1961, Soviet leaders understood that firsts mattered. The United States was preparing Project Mercury astronauts, all men. The Soviet Union had already gained the first satellite, the first human in space, and the first woman could become another ideological victory. A group of women was recruited for cosmonaut training. They faced centrifuges, isolation, physical conditioning, spacecraft systems lessons, pressure suits, and the problem of being both pioneers and political evidence. The Vostok spacecraft was simple by later standards, but simple did not mean safe. The cosmonaut sat inside a spherical descent module attached to an equipment section. Automation carried much of the flight because Soviet planners worried about how humans would perform in orbit. Manual controls existed but were restricted. The cabin was cramped, the view was limited, communications were intermittent. A person in Vostok did not fly like a pilot banking an aircraft. She endured, monitored, reported, and trusted a machine built at the edge of what engineers had proven. Vostok 6 was paired with Vostok 5, flown by Valery Bykovsky, which had launched 2 days earlier. The flights were not a rendezvous in the later docking sense, but they created a joint mission in orbit and a propaganda image of coordinated Soviet mastery. Tereshkova launched from Baikonur on June 16. Once in orbit, she reported to the ground under the call sign Cheka. The world heard that a woman was circling Earth, and Soviet media had a message ready. Socialism had opened a future that old societies had denied. Inside the capsule, the mission was less tidy than the public message. Tereshkova experienced nausea and discomfort, and later accounts described difficulties with orientation and mission procedures. There was also a serious programming issue in the spacecraft's control system that required correction instructions from the ground. These details do not erase the achievement, they make it more concrete. Spaceflight in 1963 was not routine. It was a narrow margin between calculation, training, and danger. For nearly 3 days, Tereshkova orbited Earth. She kept logs, communicated with ground controllers, and served as a living test of whether a woman could withstand orbital flight. That question sounds offensive now, but it mattered to the institutions making decisions then. Space agencies were still building medical evidence about weightlessness, isolation, re-entry stress, and the limits of the human body. Vostok 6 turned one woman's flight into data, theater, and proof. The return was as dramatic as the launch. Like other Vostok cosmonauts, Tereshkova ejected from the capsule during descent and came down by parachute. The capsule landed separately. This detail was politically sensitive because early spaceflight records depended on rules about pilots landing with their craft. The Soviet Union did not foreground every technical detail at once. But the recovery sequence shows how primitive and bold the system was. Fiery re-entry, ejection seat, parachute canopy, open land, and a cosmonaut returning from orbit under fabric and lines. After landing, Tereshkova became an international celebrity. She toured, spoke, received honors, and became a symbol of Soviet modernity. Her image appeared in newspapers, ceremonies, and official memory, but the institutional legacy was uneven. The Soviet Union did not immediately open a steady path for women into space. The next woman in space, Svetlana Savitskaya, did not fly until 1982. Tereshkova remained both a breakthrough and evidence of how easily a breakthrough can be contained after the headline fades. That tension is the heart of the story. Vostok 6 showed that a woman could fly a solo orbital mission in the earliest age of human spaceflight. It also showed that selection could be shaped by propaganda as much as by institutional commitment. Tereshkova's courage was personal. The mission's timing was geopolitical. The public meaning was revolutionary. The follow-through was limited. The Cold War setting matters because neither superpower treated space as pure exploration. Every launch carried claims about engineering, education, military capability, national organization, and the future. For the Soviet Union, sending Tereshkova into orbit was a way to say that its system could produce not only rockets but a new social order. For viewers abroad, especially women watching a field dominated by military test pilots and male engineers, the image could still be powerful even when it was staged by a state. The technology also deserves attention. Vostok was a transitional machine between ballistic survival and true spacecraft operation. It had life support, radio links, attitude control, heat shielding, retrorockets, and recovery systems, but it offered little comfort or agency. Tereshkova's flight therefore sits at a moment when human beings were still learning what it meant to be passengers, operators, subjects, and symbols in orbit. The next checkpoint after Vostok 6 was not a simple march toward equality. It was a long wait. Women remained rare in space programs for decades. The United States would not fly an American woman, Sally Ride, until 1983. The Soviet Union's own second woman, Savitskaya, flew in 1982 and later became the first woman to perform a spacewalk. Tereshkova's solo flight became more extraordinary because it was not quickly normalized. Today, the mission matters because it forces two truths into the same frame. The first is that Valentina Tereshkova did something astonishing. She rode a new and dangerous spacecraft into orbit and returned alive from nearly 3 days above Earth. The second is that institutions can celebrate a first without changing themselves enough to make the second, third, and fourth ordinary. Vostok 6 was a door open for the cameras, and then only partly held open. That does not diminish Tereshkova's place in history, it sharpens it. The Seagull's flight was not just a Soviet headline or a space race statistic. It was a test of machinery, ideology, public imagination, and human endurance. On June 16, 1963, the first woman in space looked down on Earth from a cramped spherical cabin. The view belonged to one cosmonaut, but the question it left behind belonged to everyone. Who gets to represent the future, and what happens after the world applauds the first?